So, hi everyone, Colin Earhart. I'm also on the content committee. Wanted to quickly introduce both our moderator, Miles Rappaport, and to thank him especially for his structuring of this conversation, both in sort of making this come to fruition and also in really some great debrief conversations, both with the panelists and for those who were unable to join. So really excited about this conversation. So quick bio on Miles. Miles is a senior practice fellow in American Democracy at the Ash Center here at the Harvard Kennedy School for Democratic Governance and Innovation. Miles is a longtime organizer, policy advocate, and elected official, and brings to the Ash Center 4 decades of experience working to strengthen democracy and democratic institutions in the United States. Prior to his appointment at the Ash Center, Miles was most recently president of the independent grassroots organization Common Cause. For 13 years, he headed the Public Policy Center Demos. Rappaport previously served as Connecticut's Secretary of State and a state legislator for 10 years in Hartford. He has written, spoken, and organized widely on issues of American democracy. He was also a member of the Harvard class of 1971. Well, welcome, Miles. Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
Is this working?
No.
Okay. All right. I want to thank Colin very much and the content group of the conference. I've been here for the last few hours, and it's really a fabulous, fabulous conference. So congratulations to both and all of you. And I also want to share and appreciate what Kate said. We're keenly aware of the fact that we are an all-white panel in a situation where voting rights are at risk for communities of color in, places around the country. Kristen Clark, who's a good friend and former colleague of Brenda's and current colleague of Julie's, was going to be with us, but we have Julie, who has been one of the key people in the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights since then. So you have what you have, but I think we have some good information to share with you, but we're not unmindful of the issue as well. Anyway, so was listening to and reading some of the part of the Special Rapporteur's report, and he didn't actually talk about it in the session today, but part of the report about the United States has to do with how our democracy functions and the low levels of voting participation, the skewed levels of voting participation, the disenfranchisement of people with felony convictions, the overwhelming influence of money, big money in our political system, and on and on. And for those people in the United States who are used to kind of being exporters of our democracy, it could be very uncomfortable. Fortunately, none of us are in that category. We have been keenly aware and are keenly aware, and more people are becoming keenly aware of the flaws and the failures of our democratic system to be truly, truly representative. So, we have huge issues that have to do with voting across the board. We have tremendous issues about how districts are drawn, gerrymandering, redistricting, making meaningful your vote. We absolutely have issues about campaign finance that has been ruined, in my view. We're not talking about it so much today, but it's been ruined by the Supreme Court decision starting back with the Buckley v. Vallejo decision in 1976 and coming all the way forward. We definitely have issues around the disenfranchisement of, well, it's less than 6 million now, thanks to Florida. It's down to about 4.5 million people who are disenfranchised by virtue of having a felony conviction, of which 75% are no longer in prison. I think this is an area where there's been some real progress as well. So we're going to actually look at this from I'm going to introduce our panelists and look at it from 3 perspectives. And the structure of the conversation is for that. And we're going to leave plenty of time for conversation, which, by the way, is not, I don't consider a question and answer. You all know a lot, and so more than happy to have you voice your opinions, and we'll have an informal conversation afterwards. But the first is historical perspective. These issues are not new. They have been with us since the founding of the Republic, and no one knows more about that and has written more about that than Professor Alex Kasar. Second perspective is to look straight in the eye without blinking at all of the challenges that we are facing, from voter suppression to structural flaws to the ways in which inequality has embedded itself in our democratic process, etc. But the third perspective, and I think it's a really important one, is a forward-looking one. Is about the movement to make our democracy more reflective, to make our democracy more inclusive, to make it more vibrant and participatory. And I have been very pleased over the last really 30 years to consider myself part of that movement. And it is important also to look at ways in which people are being hurt and damaged by the failures in the democratic system. It's also really important to look, in my mind, at the ways in which people have successfully fought back against suppression, but also made genuine both legislative and policy reforms that have made a real difference. So we have three people who are really, really qualified, hyper-qualified. I wouldn't say overqualified, but hyper-qualified to talk about this. So quick introductions. They all have biographies. They're as long as your arm. But Alexander Kaysar is the Matthew Sterling Professor of History and Social Policy. He has written what many consider the definitive book on the right to vote and its history in the United States, called The Right to Vote, The Contested History of Democracy in the United States. He's won numerous prizes for it, has been recognized by the National Historical Societies countrywide for it. He chaired the Social Science Research Council Commission on Voting and Elections, and he's now writing a book on the Electoral College, cheekily titled, "Why Do We Still Have the Electoral College?" An objective view, I guarantee you. Anyway, Brenda Wright, who's been my friend and colleague for a long period of time, is the Senior Advisor for Legal Strategies for Demos. She's led many, many progressive legal and policy initiatives on voting rights, has argued 2 cases before the United States Supreme Court, one on campaign finance, the Randall v. Sorrell case, and one on voting rights, the Young v. Fordyce. Before she came to Demos, she served as the managing director and managing attorney for the National Voting Rights Institute here in Boston, and for a long time was director of the Voting Rights Project at the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, and she got out before Julie arrived, but she worked for the outfit that Julie Hauk now works for. Julie Hauk is the managing counsel for election protection for the Lawyers Committee on Civil Rights. She joined the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law as senior special counsel in May of 2014, and began her current role as the managing counsel for the Election Protection Project just last October. She has helped to lead litigation teams in cases that have included challenges to voting rights, voter caging, discriminatory and illegal voter purging and vote dilution, and unconstitutional gerrymanders. So she's paid her dues in the courtroom. Before that, she spent 29 years as a civil rights lawyer in private practice in California. So let me start, I think, as you would imagine, with the historical perspective from Professor Kaysar. Alex?
Thank you, Miles. Can I just tilt this? Can you hear me? Is this on?
No, sir, no, sir.
How's that? No. No, it's too close. Thank you. Thank you, Miles, for the introduction, and thank you, folks, for inviting me to participate here. I want to say I feel especially honored to be with this group. I have known Miles and Brenda for a very long time. I've worked with them. I don't know Julie, but I've worked with the Lawyers Committee and people from the Lawyers Committee on many occasions. And I'm very happy to be here to see what I contribute to this conversation. As is often my fate, I find myself as a historian who works on contemporary issues, usually the first speaker given 5 to 7 minutes saying, okay, you do the last 200 years in the next 7 minutes, and then we'll get down to the serious stuff. So I'm going to obviously try to focus my remarks about the history and try to hit certain highlights that I think or at least I thought this morning when I was writing my notes, that I think are relevant to thinking about these contemporary problems which we're all facing. So and then I'm going to say something particular about the last 20 to 30 years and what may or may not be different about this.
Can everybody hear okay, by the way? Okay?
Yes?
Good.
Okay, first let me start here. The original sin of democracy or democratic failure or democratic shortcoming in the United States resides in the decision of the framers of the Constitution not to say anything about the right to vote, right? Look at the text of the original Constitution, there is nothing, the phrase the right to vote does not appear. That was not an accident, but it was also not a matter of theory or judgment. It was, that decision was made, the decision was made to leave voting rights to the states, okay? And the reason that the framers made that decision, again, it had nothing to do with abstract arguments or virtues. It had to do with the fact that every existing state already had some franchise requirement. And the fear was that if they imposed any single standard, that it might annoy people in some state and jeopardize the politics of constitutional ratification, okay? So the reason we have this structure has to do with the politics of the late 1780s, okay? But it's created a structure that remains to this day. And since that time, of course, there have been numerous constitutional amendments that constrain what the states can do, but still we live in an environment where a great deal is up to the states, which my fellow panelists certainly know better than I do. Second point, the long arc of historical change with respect to voting rights is towards expansion and more inclusiveness, at least up to the 1970s. Okay, that long arc may have come to a close in the 1970s. But even within this long arc, and it's something to keep in mind, progress has not always been continuous. In fact, more often than not, it has been a pattern of one step forward, or two steps forward and one step back, or two steps forward and three steps back. Okay? This is not, you know, if you read the Congressional Quarterly history of the franchise in the United States, it's, oh, you know, first we got rid of property requirements, and then tax-paying requirements, and then we got rid of racial restrictions, and then we enfranchised women, and then there's always a little anomaly here, because then we got rid of racial restrictions again. Which is one thing, well, why do we have to do this twice, or more, you know, or more than twice? But in fact, the predominant pattern is a progress followed by retrogression. Okay, and that's very important to keep in mind as we try to locate what is going on in the present. Because at least, you know, what I want to argue is that in fact what we're seeing in this period is a retrogression that follows a period of progress. Third point, relevant to the broader themes of this conference, is that many, if not most, but certainly not all, restrictions on the franchise in U.S. history have been based on class and have been designed to exclude the less well-off. Okay? You know, the most well-known of these in the early republic have to do with property requirements, tax-paying requirements, and then a notable, much less known fact, and this has to do again with the pattern of one step forward, one step back, is that in many of the states that got rid of property requirements, okay, this is like in the 1820s, 1830s, as they did that, they also instituted new requirements that you could not be a pauper. What's pauper? What was a pauper? A person who was dependent on the state for any aid or relief. Those pauper exclusions remain on the books in a great many states until 1970. Okay? As late as the 1930s, there are fights in some states to exclude people who are receiving relief from the New Deal, exclude them from voting on the grounds that they are paupers and should be disenfranchised. So again, it's an economic requirement, and it's less stringent than taxpaying requirements, but it applies to certain groups. It's also true, I think, that, and we have to understand that the exclusion of African Americans in the South from the late 19th century until the 1960s was class as well as race-based. The two were utterly overlapping in the history of the South. And a final point on this issue is that, you know, I've been studying the right to vote for 25 years, maybe longer. I have yet to discover any exclusion in American law that was targeted at middle class or upper class white males. Okay, there have never been any exclusions that targeted of that group. It's against this background, briefly stated, that I think that we should understand what has been happening for the last 20 years or so. The increasing obstacles to the exercise of the franchise, the appearance of voter suppression Also, the reappearance of it as a phrase, it's very interesting. If you do one of these like Google Ngram searches, you find there are actually two periods when voter suppression or vote suppression is widely used in the English language. One is the late 19th century and the other is the last 25 or 30 years. And I think that we have to understand what's going on today as a reaction against the expansions of the franchise that took place in the 1960s and the 1970s. That enfranchised African Americans in the South, Native Americans in a variety of states, and numerous other minorities in other states, including, and it's also through the Voting Rights Act, but some related, including many Hispanic immigrants. Okay? It's also true that during this period, as was true in the late 19th century, this is also a period of very large-scale immigration. Okay, so you have two things going on. One is a legal change, as was true in 1865 to 1870, enfranchising large numbers of African Americans and giving them political power for a period of 10 or 15 or 20 years. At the same time, and particularly focused in other states, you have large-scale immigration, which is threatening those in power in different states. So that what I think that one way to understand what is going on for the last 20 years is that this is a collective conservative reaction against the shifts in power that have taken place from the fulfillment of some of these aspirations for inclusion that is realized in the 1960s and 1970s, and that de facto is realized through immigration and through the ability of immigrants to become citizens, which is also one reason, for example, why it's a kind of further frontier in voting rights matters. But there's a tremendous reluctance to, stuff about sort of dealing with amnesty or whatever. One of the issues about not making the many millions of citizens who are here, not making them immigrants who are here, not making them citizens, is that if you make them citizens, they will vote. Okay, much better to keep them in some kind of legal limbo where they can't participate. So I guess, what I'm broadly saying is that we should understand where we are today as part of a period of reaction, and these periods of reaction have happened before. That's not necessarily mean, okay, it's cool, it's happened before, so don't worry, right? That's not the message. But we do want to try to understand the dynamics of why this is happening and why it's happening when this is happening. The final thing that I want to say is what the historical record suggests about how such restrictions can be combated. And again, a lot of these things, a lot of what we're seeing now, voter ID laws and a number of other procedural obstacles, these were extremely common in the late 19th and early 20th century in the North. I mean, in the South, it was more draconian and more far-reaching. But, anybody here from New York State? Okay, do you know that New York State had an English language literacy requirement to vote? No. Do you have any idea when it was passed? 1921, okay? Think about the population of New York State in 1921, right? Heavily Eastern and Southern European. There's an English language literacy requirement to vote in New York, and it is in place through the 1960s, okay? In 1964, it is disfranchising several hundred thousand people from Puerto Rico who were U.S. citizens educated in U.S. schools in Puerto Rico, but in Spanish, and they could not pass the English language. So all these obstacles, these procedural obstacles, in many ways are echoed. And what the historical record suggests is that it's difficult, not impossible, but difficult to enact reforms within the states that suppress voting. Again, mobilization is possible. It's possible to win control of state legislatures, but it's difficult. The key historically, in fact, has been the intervention of the federal government and the federal courts. And that it is only when the federal government has, in its policies, offered an affirmation of voting as a right. And that's really, in some sense, what happens in the late 1960s, when the federal government affirms voting as a right. It's only when that happens and it is affirmed, and that puts limits on the ability of states to abridge that right. I mean, what that suggests, obviously, is not only that actions in the courts, and you'll hear much more about, is extremely important, but also that national political mobilization is really the key to trying to undo this. I mean, That's why, it's one of the lenses through which I look at HR 1, the omnibus piece of voting rights legislation that is now sitting in Congress. This is a strategy, a federal strategy, to try to produce some shifts in power that may make it easier to fight these suppressive tactics in those states that are trying to utilize them. And with that, I turn it back to whomever.
Thank you very much. Okay, let me go to Brenda. And again, I want to remind you that I sort of asked them to ask Brenda and Julie to divvy their remarks a little bit into talking about the challenges first, and then the resistance and success afterwards. Does Brenda need to come up there? Can she do it from here?
She can do it from here.
Very good. Okay. Okay. So, thanks, Miles, for the introduction, and I'm really glad to be here with you all today. I think I'm going to focus my remarks on, as part of this initial problem statement that Miles has suggested that we open up with, on one of the really important structural barriers to voting and participation, and that is the requirement of voter registration. It's an issue that my organization, DEMOS, works on a lot, and it's actually a very good example of the kind of dynamic that Professor Kesar was just talking about in terms of its evolution in American history. So I think it's, the idea that you have to register before you vote is something we take for granted a lot. But that was not always the case. Up until about the middle of the 19th century, most states did not require advance registration in order for you to vote. And as that started changing, the change accelerated precisely with the influx of immigrants at the turn of the century, and, of course, the enfranchisement of African Americans in the South. And, I think it's not always fully understood how important a barrier voter registration can be just on its own to participation. It is a very important structural issue as we think about access to the ballot. Now, this slide, actually, I realized is slightly outdated. As of 2012, there were about 51 million eligible but unregistered people in the United States. I actually was checking it out. I didn't have time to change this, but as of 2016, it's now about 1 in 4. So, although I'm supposed to start with a problem statement, I guess that actually is a little bit of a flag that there's been a little bit of progress on this. But still, 1 in 4 eligible people not even being registered to vote, which is the first step you have to take in order to participate, is a serious problem. And one of the reasons it's such an important problem is that we know registration is really key to turnout. I mean, according to the census data, although only 61% of eligible people voted in 2016, it was like 87% of people who are actually registered to vote. So getting over that hurdle just turns out to be really important. And the other important thing, I think, for this purposes of this conference is to consider the ways in which access to registration is also affected by issues of inequality and poverty. So if you look at voter registration rates over time, you can see that there has been a consistent disparity between the rates at which lower income people vote compared to those with higher incomes. Now, the size of the gap has varied a little bit over time, but it is still a sizable gap. And that's an important factor in understanding what our keynote speaker was talking about when he said poverty is a political issue. It's an issue of politics, and it's going to take politics and political access to solve it. Another important point to note is that income-based differences in participation reflect the persistent effects of racial bias. So, for example, you look at white people in families making more than $75,000 constitute about a quarter of the U.S. population, 27%, but they make up more than a third of voters, 35%. And then you look at non-white families who are making less than $50,000. They make up 16% of the U.S. population, but only 11% of voters. So whatever barriers exist to registration are clearly falling more heavily on people of color and people of lower incomes. Now, it's kind of an interesting point for me that a generation ago, political scientists were fond of saying that differences in registration and turnout among different groups really didn't matter that much for democracy because the views of those who don't register and vote didn't differ substantially from the views of those who do participate. Well, if that was ever the case...
I never believed it. I never believed it.
If it was ever the case, it clearly is not the case today. And especially this is true because of the rising impact of increasing economic inequality. So you can see this in comparing public opinion research of the views of registered and non-registered people. There's some examples that I've thrown up in this slide, but one of them is over 60% of eligible unregistered people believe government should provide free community college. That's compared to just over 40% of registered voters. Strong majorities of unregistered persons believe that government aid to the poor is a good thing, but a majority of registered voters disagree. So this disparity in registration and participation has important policy outcomes. And it sort of leads to what you could consider a cycle of representational bias. There are these barriers that disproportionately affect low-income communities, communities of color. It just diminishes their voter participation. It diminishes their electoral representation in terms of who's serving in elected office. It has an impact on the policy decisions and outcomes that our elected officials reach. And then people feel disaffected. They feel they don't have a voice. They feel government isn't working for them. And they're less likely to want to participate. So this is sort of the cycle that exists because of the interplay between these structural barriers to participation and the effects of economics and race in our system. So I sort of hate to stop there, actually, because it's such a, and there is a little bit of good news to talk about, some things that we can do about this. But since I'm going to honor our plan to sort of lay out the bad news first and then talk about the good news.
My nickname is the first part of your talk is Debbie Downer, and then the second part is Pollyanna Pat. So think about that. Julie.
Adding on to the Debbie Downer part of the
Bring the mic
conference.
closer to you.
Thank you very much for having me today. I'm standing in for our Executive Director, Kristen Clark, who sends her regrets that she couldn't make it here today. I'm going to follow up on Brenda's presentation with some specific examples of voter suppression in the states. As Professor Kazar just mentioned, the Constitution left up voting to the states in large degree. So you have a hodgepodge across the country of some states expanding out access to the ballot, while others are in that regression mode, trying to take away rights and limit opportunities to vote. Starting with voter registration, some of the specific examples of suppression that's going on in the states right now involve, Georgia has an exact match voter registration requirement where when a person fills out a voter registration form, if their name does not exactly match their name as it appears on the driver's department records or in Social Security records, the application is put into a pending status, and the applicant is told you have to fix this problem within 26 months or your registration application is canceled. The voter has no way, or the applicant has no way to fix that problem because it's outside of their control. If they submit a facially complete and accurate application and the database has their name spelled wrong, they wind up in this pending status. And we found this happen most frequently with people of color from Latino, Asian American, Pacific Islander heritage who had names that were not Anglo names and were commonly misspelled by election officials when they would type their name into the system. And the same thing at the driver's services or Social Security. It was a common problem where a simple typo or an absence of a hyphen would prevent their application from being approved. We also have situations like in Kansas, in Georgia, Arkansas, Arizona, where states passed very restrictive proof of citizenship laws trying to diminish the ability of people to get on the voter registration list who couldn't comply with the owner's requirements of the documentary proof of citizenship laws. Surprisingly, this actually impacts people who are born in the United States, who don't have access to their original birth certificate, were born at home, maybe had a midwife, and can't get their documentation to prove their citizenship. We also had a situation in Florida where Amendment 4 to the Florida Constitution was passed to give the right to vote to people who had completed their felony convictions. And right away off the bat, the new governor and legislature sought to slow walk that implementation of that amendment, even though when it was passed, it had self-implementing sections to it that didn't require any legislative action. Another area to look at for voter suppression in the states is access to polling places and intimidation at the polls. We've seen repeatedly now in Georgia efforts to close, consolidate, and relocate polling places, primarily in areas serving minority and poor communities. They will go and say, well, we've got to close polling places to save money, or we have people turning out for early voting so we don't need so many polling places. This is happening in Georgia in particular, and rural poor communities with lack of access to public transportation. In Hancock County, Georgia, in 2015, the county proposed closing all but one of their polling sites. And this is in middle Georgia, very rural, poor, majority black county, where people would not have access to public transportation to get to the one polling site that would have been in the county seat. We had recently an incident in Randolph County, Georgia, where the county attempted to close all but two of their polling sites. And all the two polling sites that would have remained were in predominantly white areas. A large public outcry followed that kept those polling places open. We had a situation in Macon-Bibb, Georgia, where in an 80% black precinct, the county decided they were going to move the polling location to the sheriff's office from a gym. And there was acrimony between the black community and the sheriff's department, which would have intimidated people from turning out to that polling site. That did not result in a favorable result as a result of advocacy. People in the community actually had to have a petition drive under state law that prohibited that move. They got 20% of the electors in that precinct to sign a petition that stopped it. We've also seen efforts to suppress the vote in Indian country, where there have been like one polling place in the county seat in the majority white area of the county, and no polling sites on the reservations where a large portion of the Native American population lived. And we've had to combat those situations both in court and through advocacy. A recent event involving vote centers in Bay County, Florida was shocking after Hurricane Michael. To give credit to the supervisor of elections there, he ordered polling, they call them vote centers, throughout the county. This is Bay County and the Panhandle. And what a surprise, they didn't have a single vote center serving anywhere near the majority black poor community in Panama City. So through advocacy, we were able to finally get one polling place open the day before the election. We also see restrictive voter ID laws. There was a move right after the Shelby County versus Holder decision in 2013 to come up with suppressive ways to keep people from voting, and voter ID was prime among them in both North Carolina and in Texas. And those cases were fought in courts. We have cases where states allow people who have hunting and fishing and gun licenses to get voter IDs, but some students cannot use their school ID as a voting ID. In Georgia, for example, students who go to the University of Georgia, which has historically lower percentages of people of color as students there, those students can use their student ID to vote in Georgia, but students who attend historically black colleges and universities cannot. In the wake of the voter ID laws, some states adopted free voter ID regulations and laws to say that, hey, we've got an alternative here for people who can't show regular voter ID. And now in Georgia, in this legislative session, the legislature is contemplating remodeling that free voter ID law to say that every time someone who has the free voter ID, who's usually a person of color or somebody who's from a lower economic background, every time they move from their county to county, they have to surrender that free voter ID and then get a new one in the new county. So, this is going to create problems where people are unable to get their voter ID prior to an election and will be disenfranchised. Other examples of suppressive activity in the states involve voter purges and voter caging, which typically disproportionately affect minority and poor voters. One example of a purge in Georgia involved Hancock County, where white members of the Hancock County Board of Elections began challenging black voters in the city of Sparta ahead of a 2015 municipal election in the city where white candidates were challenging long-term black candidates for city council seats. And what they were doing would say, well, we've got a house here with 10 people in it. That's too many people to have legitimately registered to vote. So then they would schedule a challenge hearing demanding that the voters come in and explain why they're registered in a house with 10 other people. They also would go from door to door and say, hey, this is a trailer. This doesn't look like anyone could live here in this poor county in this trailer in this condition. And then send that person, they would send a sheriff out to their trailer with a summons and tell them you had to come to a challenge hearing to protect your right to vote. This went on for a complete summer in 2015 leading up to this election. We found out about it and challenged this in court. There's been other voter purges on a wide scale across some of the states, so-called list maintenance purges, where as a result of the inactivity of voters, they get an address confirmation postcard where they have to respond within a period of time, usually 30 days. And if they don't, they're put into inactive status. And if they exercise their right not to vote for 2 general election cycles, they're purged from the rolls. And we find that it really impacts majority, minority voters, and poor voters because it's a one-time mail service that you get usually, telling you you've got to respond to this little postcard within 30 days, nondescript, garbage mail that people would throw away, and then they find out when they go to vote next time they've been purged from the rolls. This was the subject of a Supreme Court decision in Ohio last term, Husted, which has allowed this to proceed. So it's really up to the states now and people in the states to advocate against having these purges done in this way. In Georgia alone, in 2017, they purged over 600,000 voters from the rolls in Georgia, over 10% of the people on the 6 million plus voter registration list do these list maintenance purges. We also have some specific examples of,
Julie?
I'm sorry.
All right.
I'm ready. Sorry. I was asked to talk about specific examples of voter suppression, and I could just, I guess, be here for weeks. Some of the more blatant ones that we've seen recently are the election fraud in North Carolina, where poor and minority voters were targeted by this scheme by the gentleman that was helping Mark Harris in his effort to become elected to the 9th Congressional District seat there, where they would go to people's homes and fill out their absentee ballots for them, fill in the candidates and take them back to the election office. We've had prosecutions of people in Georgia helping voters. We've had efforts to roll back pre-registration for high school students who register at 16, which helps them become civically engaged. States want to roll that back. So those are just some examples of the way these structural barriers are preventing and keeping people from being able to vote today.
Thank you, Julie. That was great. Actually, so I think you can see the breadth of the challenge on the voter suppression issues, both through history and also now. But I do want to segue, and I'm familiar with these statistics because I just recently wrote a piece for the American Prospect magazine, which was titled "The Good News from the Voting Awards," which is not what you just heard from Julie. But I would say this, I mean, and it's not an either or. There is dastardly efforts to suppress votes, to keep legitimately eligible people from voting, and they need to be fought. Thankfully, with organizations like the Lawyers Committee, like the Advancement Project, like DEMOS, like the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, these are being fought, and a lot of victories have been won. I think we'll probably hear about. So I think but that's like really, really important to take that fight. But I think it's also important to recognize that some real progress has been made. If you go back to the Florida election, I mean, again, go back to 1830, but if you just go back to 2000, after the debacle in Florida, we have had the development of a kind of a more and more robust, democracy movement, which has made, not at the federal level, ironically, based on what Alex was saying, done made very little progress. In fact, backward progress at the federal level with the disembowelment of the Voting Rights Act. But at the state level, let me just give you some examples of how it has actually become easier for people to register and vote, and where I think you can see an impact. So just a couple, I'll just tick off a few things. In 2008, there were 2 states where you could actually do online registration. In 2018, there were 40 states where that was possible, okay? In 37 states, we used to complain a lot, I did, about why is it that it's Tuesday? Why Tuesday? You had to show up in person, and if you were working and if you couldn't get time off, it was impossible. Well, there are now 37 states where they have early voting, where anywhere from 2 to 4 weeks in advance of the election you can vote. So it makes the Tuesday issue, it's still an issue, but it's much less of an issue. There are 23 states where young people 16 and 17 years old can pre-register and then go on the ballot. Automatically get put on the voting rolls when they turn 18. When I was first starting at DEMOS back in 2001, there were 6 states that had same-day voter registration, which is a reform that everyone says, if you have same-day registration in your state, it's 5 to 7 points higher turnout. There are now 17 states, and as of the 2020 election, there will be 20 states that have same-day voter registration, okay? And automatic voter registration, which is sort of a new wrinkle, where when you go to the motor vehicles department, they automatically put you on the rolls unless you say no. That's now, it's only been operative in Oregon and a couple of other states, but there are now 13 states where it is in some stage of implementation. Even on the felony disenfranchisement issue, which I thought would have been, always thought would have been a really, really tough issue, states are making some real progress. Again, the Florida case that Julie mentioned, where there are 1.4 million people who were disenfranchised by virtue of having a felony conviction, and a hugely successful campaign to do a constitutional amendment, Amendment 4, to allow people with felony convictions who have their sins to vote, just passed in 2018. And my latest report from Desmond Meade, who was the leader of that fight, is that there have been no, despite early talk, as Julie was saying, about slow walking into the legislature, there have been no barriers, and thousands of people have registered since January 18th when it started. So anyway, that's a sort of example. There are one or two that I'm missing and leaving out, but you get the gist. Oh yeah, mail-in voting. Number of states, Oregon, Washington, Colorado, and a few others, and it's increasing, have, everyone gets sent a ballot. And in those states, again, it's one more convenient way of doing it, and you can either mail in the ballots or you can take them to a voting center. I guess what I'm saying is no thanks to the people who want to suppress the vote, but big thanks to people like Brenda and Julie and the organizations in that movement. We've made some real progress, and in 2018, it's interesting, because people used to say, I used to be accused of being like a process person, which was like, the worst thing you could call somebody. I didn't care about content, just about, I was a guru, a good government person. Because these things didn't necessarily seem to be making much difference. But in 2014, 83 million people voted. Okay, that's how many people voted in the previous midterm. So I made the case in this article that a combination of, obviously a motivated electorate because of Trump and all of the associated things, plus tremendous amount of mobilization by organizations, by candidates, by parties, etc. But that overlaid on the ability in many states around the country, and not just blue states, many states around the country to have more access to ballots and more ability for campaigns to get their voters out, for instance. You would see a turnout that would shatter the presumptions that midterm elections are. So the bottom line is that in 2018, 118 million people. So it went from 83 million in 2014 to 118 million. It's over a 40% increase in voting. So I think we're in a situation where this stuff is starting to take hold, and I think we have the opportunity to make some real progress. But it will take the work of people in the organizations that are doing that fight. So that's why I'm delighted to force and require Brenda and Julie to be Pollyanna Pass for their next relatively brief comments, because I do want to get to the open discussion part. Brenda? Sure. Start with you. By the way, my nickname at Demos was Pollyanna Pete. That's what we call it. So take what I say with a grain of salt.
So, starting down the road of Pollyanna, one of the really important goals that advocates for voting rights and for lowering the barriers have had is to shift the frame. We have had this framework in which the responsibility of getting yourself registered is on each individual. You got to figure out what papers you need, and you got to figure out where to do it, and it's different rules in different states, and you got to do it 30 days in advance, and all of this. Shifting the frame to understanding voting and registration as a responsibility of government, that it's government's responsibility to get people onto the rolls rather than have this set of obstacles and burdens that have to be overcome. And real quickly, one of the important ways you see the impact of shifting that frame is that comparing turnout in countries that put most of the burden on the government, which are in that second column, with the turnout in countries that put the most burden on individuals, is just very stark, very extreme. So that's, just one indicator of the potential for can we get there in the U.S. And one of the pieces of legislation that has gotten us partway there is the National Voter Registration Act of 1993. It was enacted more than 25 years ago. And it has, I think it's mostly known for the motor voter sections of where you can go in, and as you're applying for a driver's license, you can also register to vote. But there's also another very important provision of the law that requires states to make voter registration available in public assistance offices as well. And that was a really key part of the legislative fight, because advocates, and I was around at that time when it was enacted, advocates knew that there was a whole group of people that wouldn't be reached if you could only register at the DMVs. Unfortunately, although there was a real substantial increase in registration at these agencies right after the law was passed. One of the things that Demos discovered in doing some research into this was that by 2005, which was 10 years after the enactment of the NBRA, the numbers had just plummeted. And that turned out not to be because, gee, everybody had somehow gotten registered, and so they didn't need to register anymore. Of course, registration is an ongoing thing, and people don't remain registered forever. So what we discovered was that this was really a function of states simply falling out of compliance. You know, they got it right for a few years, but there are changes in personnel, there's turnover, there's just forgetting to do it, there's running out of voter registration forms. We encountered all kinds of excuses like that as we started looking into why these numbers had declined so dramatically. So Demos and some other partners launched an effort to really revitalize voter registration at these agencies, to go to the states, give them the evidence that they were not doing what they're supposed to be doing, and ask them to make changes. We started out asking politely, thinking that they would certainly realize that this was their responsibility and they would be sorry that they had been overlooking it, but we later realized that we were going to have to start suing. And at this point, these are the states you see here are the states where we have engaged in that kind of enforcement work. It's not always a lawsuit. Sometimes they will come around after you send a notice letter. But in one way or another, in each of these states, we've made some progress. This is one of my favorite graphics, because in North Carolina, it's an interesting story. We first engaged in North Carolina in about 2006, bringing to their attention the problems that the agencies were not fulfilling their obligations. And you might notice that after 2006, the numbers of voter registrations in those agencies went up pretty dramatically. We had the cooperation of Gary Bartlett, a wonderful public servant who was the chair of the state elections board at that time, and once this was brought to his attention, he did make it his business to make sure that these agencies throughout all the counties were doing their jobs. Now, you might notice there's a little drop-off subsequently, and that is about 2012 to 2013. So what happened in 2012? Republicans took over both branches of the legislature and the governorship. They removed Gary Bartlett from his role as head of the state elections board, and lo and behold, the numbers immediately plummeted again. So this time we went back in, we reinvestigated, we had to file a lawsuit this time. And once we filed the lawsuit, which was about 2013, you can see that, yes, once again, the numbers go back up. And so the reason I like this is just, it shows that you really can have an impact. You know, you can really affect the numbers. They had dropped below 20,000, and now they're back up to almost 50,000 as of 2016. So that's part of the good news. Ohio's another example. Since we started working in Ohio, an additional more than 800,000 people have registered at public assistance agencies since we began that work there. And then, you know, here's the overall trajectory of the numbers over time, starting with the 1995 when the act first went into effect, and ending up in 2016, the most recent election. And you see that low point there, 2005, 2006, and I like this graphic because it resembles that meme of like, right? And I like to think of that as, that's when we said, we might as well sue. of those increases. But we do think it's an important part of the picture. And it's important, in part because of who is using it. If you look at what percentage of people making less than $30,000 per year use these agencies to vote, it's almost half. So it's just another indicator of the importance of this particular piece of the puzzle in addressing some of the problems we've identified. I can stop there. Miles already raised the issue of automatic voter registration being the next step, that instead of just having the opportunity to register when you go to one of these agencies, the government actually takes the information it has already on file about you because of your use of these government services and automatically registers you, giving you the chance to opt out, but making it a default that you will be registered to vote if you are eligible. And as Miles said, that has had a tremendous impact in Oregon already, where it's been fully implemented. And there are now, I think, 15 states and the District of Columbia that have enacted that as well. So I think I'll stop there and make sure Julie gets a chance to give the good news as well.
So in the good news department, there have been successful advocacy as well as litigation efforts in the states to combat some of the voter suppression that's been going on. So it's not all a lost cause by any stretch of the imagination. And first, I cite to the fact that through grassroots efforts, organizing communities, having them come to legislative sessions and to local boards of elections and proceedings where they can actually confront their representatives with the facts showing how their conduct will suppress the vote has been successful, even in Georgia and other places that have tried to enact restrictive voter regulations and rules. One example is in 2017 with the Georgia legislature, they attempted to do a mid-decade redistricting. They had already done one prior in an area around Gwinnett County and Henry County where there's been a tremendous increase in minority populations in those areas of the state. And the white Republicans in the state legislature saw that they had dwindling possibilities of becoming reelected. So they wanted to move the goalposts just a little bit to ensure that they'd be reelected again. And grassroots organizations in Georgia got wind of this. It was done in a backroom effort to change the maps at the last minute. Some of the Democrats in the legislature didn't even know this was happening. But once word got out, people turned out and raised a ruckus. It got national press. And finally, they decided not to move forward with this ill-advised plan. So you can do things outside the courtroom that have positive results. And then there have been a lot of successes in redistricting cases involving both gerrymanders, unconstitutional gerrymanders along racial lines and vote dilution, where counties and other localities have packed minority voters into a district to limit their influence in elections, or craft the minority population across the county or across local jurisdictions to prevent them from having a say in the elections. But there have been successes both in congressional redistricting and vote dilution cases and in localities. And it's really important to consider school boards, for example. There have been successes in Ferguson and in Georgia and North Carolina and other places about school boards. People don't always think of school boards as being so important, but they are. And if you don't have diversity on the school board, how are you going to have any representation of minority students in the school and their parents? So it's really important to look at the districting coming up, and I think we'll talk more about that as we go on. But there's just been a panoply of successful litigations just in the last year, including getting early voting sites in Florida. The League of Women Voters sued the Secretary of State there because they wanted to prevent universities in Florida from having early voting sites to suppress the student vote. But the League of Women Voters was successful in the litigation there.
Great. No, it's really amazing, actually, if you really look at the breadth of the successful fights that have been waged, both defensive and offensive. All right, before we open it up, just want to give Alex a chance to sort of weigh in here a little bit.
Yeah, I came all the way from Porter Square, so I wanted to get a little more airtime. And the organizer of the conference had also encouraged me to say something about my work on the electoral college. I'm going to be very sparing about that, but I want to say a couple of things, particularly about the intersection of the electoral college and voting rights. But let me say one thing for those of you who feel this. Yes, we should get rid of the electoral college. Oh my God, how can we do it? It's impossible, etc. And this book, which is now going to press, is about the many attempts that have been made and why they have failed. But just a note of encouragement, something that probably most of you do not know. In 1969, the House of Representatives passed a constitutional amendment calling for a national popular vote and abolition of the electoral college by an 82% vote. Okay, a year later in the Senate, that amendment was defeated very narrowly by a filibuster. Okay, and so we were within about 4 or 5 votes in September of 1970 of getting rid of the electoral college. It's not. I mean, it doesn't seem like an easy haul right now, but it's not outside the realm of possibility. Now that said, the last thing I want to say is I want to share a nightmare with you that I've been having. Okay, and because I'd like you to have this nightmare too. And most of you are too young to have followed in great detail the 2000 election. Right? But the 2000 election, when Florida was deadlocked, okay, at some point there was a move by the Republican legislature, okay, the Republican-dominated legislature, to say that if the court cases had turned out differently, the Republican legislature was going to ignore the popular vote, and it was going to choose presidential electors by itself, and it was going to choose Republican electors. Okay, it was going to say, forget the popular vote. Doesn't really matter. And in fact, the Supreme Court, if you look at the wording of the Constitution says, electors shall be chosen in such manner as the legislature of each state shall decide. And what's implicit there, and what was underscored in the Supreme Court decisions at the time, was that in fact, the U.S. citizen has no right to vote for president. Okay? And that unless and until the state legislature says that its electors are going to be chosen by a popular election, you don't have that right, and the state legislature can take that back. In effect, what the Florida legislature was trying to do would have been constitutional. Now, I consoled myself at the time, and I was consulting a little bit to the people of the minority, the Democrats in the legislature. I consoled myself at the time by saying, well, look, this is a theoretical loophole possibility. But given the existence of democratic norms and how strong they are in the United States, this could never really happen. Okay. Well, I'm older now and wiser, and I've lived through 2 years of the current nameless regime, and I'm not sure that those democratic norms are in fact strong enough to absolutely prohibit such an action. If a state picture as a legislature, a state with a Republican legislature, and the state votes Democratic, and it would be decisive in the election. So that is just one more reason why we need to do something about electoral college reform, although it won't be easy. And I'm happy to answer any questions you have.
All right, thank you very much. Okay. Oh, okay. Okay, so let's open it up either to questions or comments. I saw you first. Yeah.
Thank you. My name's Alistair. I'm actually a physician down the street at Mass General Hospital, former alum of the K School. Thank you guys for the work that you guys do. It's incredibly important. I see the faces of failed policy in the ER every night. So I think getting folks registered to vote is an incredibly important first step. You mentioned earlier, Dr. Kesar, nightmares, and I'm wondering on the opposite end of that, dreams. Looking sort of at the 40,000-foot view, are there certain nonprofits or programs out there that you guys think are really killing it, that are doing an incredible job? I think of Turbo Vote that came out of this institution, came out of Hurricane School, other organizations like Headcount that are registering folks to vote. Just wondering you have examples of either programs or nonprofits that are really doing a great job.
Okay, who wants to take that first? Anybody?
Well, I can speak to some. Beyond the state levels.
Julie, take the mic closer to you.
Beyond the state levels or even the national levels, there's grassroots groups on the ground in the states that are doing registration work. State Voices and some other organizations have civic engagement tables that have memberships that do really good work, especially targeting underserved and minority communities registering to vote. On the national level, there's Rock the Vote, which has been very important in expanding the civic engagement and voter registration for younger people, especially ACLU, Lawyers Committee, DEMOS, a lot of national organizations that do voter empowerment and voter protection work have been leading the charge on making sure that people are able to register to vote.
So I would point to a few other things as well. As Miles mentioned, the campaign on Amendment 4 in Florida, and Desmond Meade's leadership on that was an astounding example of organizing, and I think it's going to resonate in terms of victories elsewhere, other victories in Florida, hopefully, but other states, I think, are going to be able to learn from that. And that was a whole coalition of groups that worked on that. Florida New Majority was one of them, many, many others. So there is increasing, I think, power and energy at the state and local level, which is really encouraging. Another group I would mention is the Southern Coalition for Social Justice, which is based in North Carolina and just has a very powerful presence in that state. And of course, there have been so many voting issues in North Carolina since 2012 that it keeps attorneys busy full-time. But they are a great example of how you can combine advocacy and litigation and organizing to really make progress. I would point to the moral majority movement that Reverend Barber in North Carolina began, and that he's sort of taking more national as a very exciting development. And also importantly, I think, is to point out that it was not only Florida that had this successful ballot initiative on a democracy issue in the last election, but there were something like 18 or 20 initiatives on state ballots regarding voting rights, money in politics, disclosure, pro-voter reforms that almost all of them passed. And what's exciting about that is that it's just proof of the concept that the public is with us on these issues. I mean, if you can present it the right way, if you can, message it, if you can get the word out, if you can do the organizing, and I think that's tremendously encouraging.
Let me just add 3 quick points on that, very quick. One is to hold up with something that Julie said, which is in states around the country, there are what are called voter registration tables. Some of them are nonpartisan nonprofits, some of them are more issue and election oriented, but where community organizations come together around a table, have access to the tools to really get people registered and get them onto the polls and use those things in collective and coordinated ways that they didn't used to do. So I think that's really important. Number 2, organizations that were not specifically democracy organizations. So Common Cause and DEMOS and the Lawyers Committee are sort of, that's their business, is to work on democracy. But labor unions, environmental organizations, civil rights organizations, women's organizations, gay and lesbian organizations, have decided over the last few years that, marriage equality may be my first issue, but democracy has to be my second issue, because if the democracy doesn't work and the money pours in on to prevent progress and people are prevented from voting, we're not going to make those gains. So you have organizations like the Democracy Initiative, which is Common Cause and the AFL-CIO and the communication workers and the NAACP, all getting together saying, in addition to our principal issues, we're going to take on democracy second. And the last point, very quick, is it's extraordinary how front and center these issues are now, in a way that they absolutely were not. I used to just pull my hair out because it was like you couldn't get attention on these issues. And here we are. What is H.R. 1? H.R. 1, which is the first bill out of the box, first resolution out of the box for the House Democrats, now that they're in the majority, is a wildly comprehensive voting reform bill, that has voting rights and felony disenfranchisement and campaign finance reform and gerrymandering and a whole bunch of other things. Not going to pass with the Senate and with President Trump in office, but as a marker, as an indicator of how seriously these issues are being taken, it's quite an extraordinary step forward. Okay. Short question, long answer, but let's keep going.
I have a question for the entire panel. I just wondered how you all think ranked choice voting fits into this.
Anybody? Want to take it? Brenda?
I think ranked choice voting I think it's one of the tools in the toolbox. I don't know if it's the most critical thing everywhere, but Maine has just recently had some very good success with it. It is, and I think that's like the first statewide use of ranked choice voting. So that's, setting an exciting precedent. But yeah, trying to find ways so that people don't waste their votes, but you can still have a broad range of candidates and not just limit it to the two parties. That's overall, I think, a healthy thing.
I would agree with that completely. It's important, but it's not the panacea. I think it's one of the things that we should do. I would add a tiny little asterisk as somebody who lives in Cambridge, which has ranked choice voting. It's really a nuisance. So there has to be. We have to gain experience and figure out ways to make it smoother.
Alex? Julie, want to say something?
No.
Okay.
Well, I just want to thank you for asking the question that I gave you on that little piece of paper, because I happen to run a study group on election issues. And on Tuesday, March 5th, my guests are going to be the people who won the ranked choice voting initiative in Maine and the people who are leading it in Massachusetts. So if you just want to go to the Ash Center and HKS Daily and look for my study group, you're more than welcome to come. Yes?
Adam?
Thank you. So you actually partially answered the question I was going to ask regarding whether you see that it's very rare for any issues to be able to be a part of the policy agenda window every couple of years, as voting seems to be recently, but you alluded to the idea that it's relatively rare for voting to be this much a part of the policy agenda window across the country and in various states. I guess is it true that I guess the question is more about how do we maintain coalitions in the off-cycle years or between midterms, and the odd years, given that it seems like every couple of years is ripe for the organizing to finally kind of kick into high gear and be on the public's kind of mindset. And then another question was about international solidarity movements about democracy and how they affect America and our thinking about it. I know with environmental justice, there's international movements, and with various other issues of importance, there are international movements. But is it America's exceptionalism that kind of keeps us thinking kind of only about our voting rights in America, or are there movements that try to think international and use that to leverage how we do coalitions here?
Anyway, Alex, you want to take a crack?
Well, I think that there's a healthy dose of sort of insidious American exceptionalism in our reluctance to look at what goes on in other countries and other places which might do things a whole lot better. And there are plenty of examples of that. We look at Australia, which has compulsory voting. We could even, because of technology, one could look at Brazil. Problematic as Brazil's political system is, they actually have a remarkably simple and efficient system of electronic voting. voting. You know, in the current political climate, there's something almost politically hazardous about looking at international comparisons for health, but intellectually and politically, it probably makes a lot of sense.
I'll address your question about keeping the coalition will work together in the off years. The Lawyers Committee, we lead the Election Protection Coalition, which has the 1-866 Our Vote hotline. And previously, we would focus on major national elections, but we've now come around to a 365 model where we're going to be working with our partners on the national level and in the states to help with off-year elections. A lot of the municipal elections across the country happen in odd years, and we'll be having ramped up efforts on election protection. And we have a large group of lawyer volunteers and grassroots volunteers that help with that work. We also look at the fact that in many of the states that are very interested in purging their voter rolls, they often do it in odd years. So we're encouraging people to keep coalitions together, to watch who's being purged, to try and re-register those people and make sure that they're back on the rolls in time to vote for the 2020 election. So we look at this not as just, you know, every presidential election or a midterm election, but a 365-day-a-year effort by the national groups and the local groups and the coalitions working together.
Yeah, I'll just maybe mention one other thing, because I think this is such an important question of keeping this going when it's not just a major election. And one of the things that we've been doing at Demos is developing sort of long-term relationships with state-based groups that think that they may have a way of using democracy issues to help build independent political power for, you know, other issues that these groups care about, economic justice issues, you know, housing issues, all kinds of issues. And so kind of it's an effort to sort of build a cohort of these groups across different states, led primarily by people of color, and give them sort of a table to come to and learn from each other and sustain the momentum that they have created. So there's a lot of interesting stuff going on out there around all of this.
Okay, yeah.
Thank you guys so much. This has been really incredibly enlightening for me. I have lots of questions, but the one I'm going to stick to is maybe directed at you, Professor Pesar, would be about the Electoral College. I kind of feel like there's been, in all these other areas, I say this sort of a little too generally, like there's been some progress made, but it seems like with the Electoral College, like we've done nothing to address that, or like at least in like a national political level. Is there any path forward that you see of getting rid of the Electoral College, or what would be a path forward for that to happen?
Somebody should write a book about it, that's what
No, I mean, look, one of the startling things, and not normally for, you know, the same people like myself who studied this, but, you know, for people generally, is that if you look at American public opinion, you know, throughout most of the 20th century, people would have said, if there's ever an election in which we end up with the wrong winner, then we're definitely going to get rid of the Electoral College, right? You know, if it ever turns out that way, it's always the hazard, right? And everybody, you know, and I have actually lots of quotes from newspaper columnists saying, you know, aha, it's going to happen. And then, you know, after the 2000 election, it was like this little whimper, right? You know, and you know, and nothing happened. And the key to that is that from about 1980 to the present, but most extremely from the late 1990s to the present, Electoral College reform has become a partisan issue in a way that it actually never quite was before. And the Republicans, for reasons that are obscure and inconsistent, and also, by the way, that they changed their minds on a little bit, you know, have been opposed to any reform as a lurking fear that it's going to help the Democrats, which isn't necessarily true. That said, I want to add this, but you know, although they don't advertise it, you know, for example, after the 2012 election, a number of Republicans started putting forward the idea of ending winner take all and assigning electoral votes by district. Reince Priebus, of all people, was behind this. And, you know, and they were pushing, here's the irony, they were pushing to get rid of winner take all in Michigan, Minnesota, and Wisconsin, which were states control, which had Republican legislatures. So I think that there's some, I don't expect that partisan intransigence to last forever. I think that, let's see, I'm trying to do the scholarly term for the disaster of the Trump administration, adds additional fuel. It's kind of gratuitous, but it's fuel to the movement to get rid of the electoral college. It's been an extraordinary period. There have been no congressional hearings, full-scale hearings on electoral college reform since 1997. As far as I know, that's the only 20-year period in U.S. history when that's the case. There have been 4. The Judiciary Committee Democrats had a formal, which I spoke in 2016, but no full-scale hearings. So, you know, yeah, it's kind of grim. The other part of your question is the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact, which is another strategy, which has been going on for a while, gained a lot of steam. Its steam has slowed in the last 3 or 4 years. The organizers, they're still very dedicated to it, but I think fewer people are seeing that as a solution.
So it just passed Colorado. State of Colorado just passed it.
Yeah, but,
No,
right, but
that's 189 or something like that.
well, I mean, the key is that they need some Republican states, and they had a strategy as of 2015, 2016, that if Hillary Clinton won, there were a number of red and reddish states, including Utah, where it seemed possible that those states would tip and that would set a precedent.
Yeah.
But then that didn't happen, and in Utah in particular, what happened, because there were a lot of Republicans backing this, was that they looked at the election results in Utah in 2016, where Hillary Clinton won 22% of the popular vote, and said that if they adhered to the compact, they would be casting their electoral votes for somebody who got only 22% of the vote in their state. Not a good song.
Okay, do we have time for 1 or 2 more questions?
Sure.
Okay. Front.
Hi, my name is Kayla Fontanes. I'm with the Senate Federation. And I have a question about territories, specifically taking into consideration voting rights and voting voices of Guam, American Samoa, North Mariana, Puerto Rico, and what are the mainland efforts actually happening right now to make sure that we hear the voices, especially during the exodus of all these territories coming into the mainland. And once we, especially Puerto Ricans, at the last elections, for example, Florida, there was a large movement to get everyone registered on time. Well, what happens for those who stayed behind at their countries? And just a little light on the territories.
Well, I was actually going to pick up a little bit on your point about Florida, because one of the things that we did before this last election was we realized that there were a bunch of counties in Florida that had never really had a whole lot of Puerto Rican population that suddenly did, and they were not providing Spanish language ballot materials, as is required by a specific section of the Voting Rights Act. So 32 counties basically, you know, we went after and ended up getting relief for that election. And so, and the great thing about that is it doesn't just benefit Puerto Ricans. It benefits anybody who is not a native speaker and is a Spanish speaker instead. And so leveraging that opportunity is something we'd like to do a little bit more of as we go forward. In terms of the territories themselves and their voting rights or their ability to be heard in politics, I mean, I think it's very similar to the situation with Washington, D.C. That there's been a long-standing, you know, recognition among progressives that this is really, this lack of representation, lack of a voice is just fundamentally unfair. I'm not particularly aware of large-scale efforts going on around that, I have to say, which is not to say they're not necessarily happening, but it's not as, it honestly hasn't been as much on my radar screen, and I think it's a very important issue that does need more attention.
I think I saw one last question in the back, and then I'll give the panelists a chance if they have a concluding remark they want to make. Did I see it right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you so much, everyone for coming out today and for everyone.
Microphone.
Hello. Well, if you can hear me, thank you so much for coming out here today. Thank you everyone for asking such wonderful questions. So we've talked a lot about enfranchisement in a legal sense, which obviously is incredibly important. But I was wondering if you had any thoughts on enfranchisement after people have regained their legal right to vote. I saw some recent research about persistent turnout gaps among registered voters that persist, especially along racial lines. And I was wondering how you bring people back into the fold of democracy that has rejected them for so long.
Well, I think that from everything that I've seen from the people who are working in Florida, there's actually just a tremendous amount of excitement about participating in the wake of the ballot initiative there. I think you're absolutely right, though, that people returning citizens, even in states that had always allowed people to vote after completing a sentence, often the actual turnout is very low, and ironically, I think it's the folks who have been deprived of that opportunity for so long are going to be more galvanized than the ones who have, regained their right to vote automatically when they leave prison. So there does need to be a lot more done to figure out how to really motivate folks and give them a sense that their vote matters. And that's sort of a whole other issue that, you're right, isn't reached by the issue of the question of legal enfranchisement.
And I believe, again, the state groups that are working on civic engagement are working out plans to have sort of a one-stop shop for returning citizens about housing, schools, education, job opportunities, and trying to fold in the voting rights aspects to it and how to go vote, how to register to vote, and how to exercise the franchise.
Yeah, I mean, I want to underscore the importance of your question, because I think it would be misleading to walk away from here with the impression that the reason that a lot of sort of less advantaged folks don't vote is because of all these obstacles to voting. That's true in many cases. It's not true in most cases. Okay, and the fact is, there's an extraordinary correlation between both income and education and voting. And people at the lower ends of those spectrums have not been voting. And I think we have to recognize that for a lot of those people, it's quite plausible that that's a rational decision because neither party is offering them any. Okay, now that may be changing a little bit, and maybe it's changing a lot. But the fact is, in terms of, if you were a rational voter, a term which I despise, but look, would it make sense for you to vote? In most, would you, if you were a relatively poor person, a less educated person, would you stand to benefit from either of the winners in a mainstream election? Probably not. And I think there are problems about our political culture and ideology and the nature of our parties that are just as important as these legal issues.
That's sort of a good segue to kind of a concluding remark for any of you. Anything, Julie, that you want to add to what you said?
One thing I'd add is that we've got a very exciting period coming up in our democracy with the census, and a number of our groups are fighting back against putting the citizenship question on the census. There's litigation currently pending on that issue, and we're hopeful that that'll have a positive outcome. And then secondly, that's gonna lead into the redistricting cycle that's gonna start occurring in 2021. And I think, you know, people are better educated now, understand the wrinkles and the backdoor, you know, machinations that go on in state legislatures around redistricting. And getting people excited, knowledgeable, and turning out to these redistricting hearings is gonna be very important to make sure there's equal access to democracy going forward.
Alex?
Yeah, I guess the final comment I would like to make is to underscore the weirdness of this historical moment. Okay, and let me say what I mean by that, which is that if you look at, say, everything that's contained in HR 1, Omnibus Plus, or all the reforms that we're talking about, having to do with access to the polls, early registration, you know, for example, having nonpartisan districting commissions, all these things. These proposals would all come logically out of a Civics 101 course that you took in high school, okay? So it's on the one hand, you look at it as a whole hum, oh yeah, this is basic sort of stuff, democratic civics. But it's on the one hand, it's Civics 101. On the other hand, in the present political climate, it looks utopian. That's a weird moment.
I guess what I would take a minute to urge is just that to find a way to engage, you know, to find a way to be civically active in your community. I mean, everybody, I hope everybody's voting in this room, but there's just so much to be done in terms of making voting accessible to everybody. The Election Protection Coalition that the Lawyers Committee runs does have room for volunteers. Go be a poll worker. You know, sometimes that's where, like, the worst problems are, because the poll workers, I mean, honestly, are all over 80 years old and really not that familiar with changes in voting technology. And so, I mean, just find a way to engage beyond voting. Join one of these, you know, national groups that has a, you know, membership base. Support them. Be part of it. And the other thing I have to do is a PSA for Demos, which is that we are hiring. We're hiring counsel, and we're going to be hiring a senior policy analyst as well. So if anyone is interested in working for an organization like Demos, please keep that in mind. And I promised my legal director that I would say this.
All right, I have one quick comment to make, and then I want to just thank our panelists, and that is to take up the question that you raised and agree with what Alex said also. We had a conference in May, actually not in this room, but in one floor above, which discussed what would it take to have 80% voting participation in the United States, okay? And some of it was policy. Some of it was exactly the stuff that we've been talking about, and it would make it, and it has made a difference, and it could make a real difference. But we looked at what would it take, what would corporations need to do, you know, in terms of encouraging political participation, giving their workers the day off, you know, putting information out, et cetera. What would the media need to do? What would organizations need to do? What's the, you know, what are all of the different kind of cultural pieces that would need to come into play? Because I do think it's absolutely right. What would the parties need to do differently? What would candidates need to do to really encourage participation? So I think it's very much a multifaceted question, and I don't want to make myself sound like, you know, all we have to do is, you know, pass these 3, you know, pieces of legislation and everything will be great. I think there's a huge amount of work to do, but I'm encouraged by the kind of the growth of this movement and the level of interest in these issues that exists now. And so with that, let me say thank you all for coming. Thanks for having us.
Just so everyone knows, the next part of the schedule is a reception downstairs in the winter garden where the
For dinner. Where like the keynote was? Oh, yeah.
I'm not sure.
Okay.
email me. Where we met.
Is that right? I have a second question, so I'll follow There's a certain ironic sense to it. So yeah, I was waiting for them. Say something voting. Segue. I would say it's a rule of third. So third are really sick.
Okay, thank you.
Walking well. And then third will go either way. Third, the walking well. Folks who are just not even second. I see that they probably just and then where's that question for you? Thank you so much. Amazing to me.
If you look it up.